A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. When I first met Aaron, his odd habit of sitting on the stairs struck me as endearing, a quirk that added charm to his otherwise grounded personality. But after 3 years of marriage, what I initially found whimsical became a chilling source of contention. Every evening, like clockwork, perched against the staircase railing, he would sit staring into the shadows cast by the dim hallway light as if waiting for something, or someone. At first, I shrugged it off as a simple idiosyncrasy. We all have our routines, right? Yet, the deeper I delved into his unyielding descent into this strange fixation, the more I realized I was slipping down the rabbit hole with him. Friends raised eyebrows during dinner parties when Aaron spontaneously excused himself for stare time, and I found myself defending him when they laughed and made comments like, "Is he trying to catch ghosts?" My own laughter had faltered awkwardly, but dismissing the behavior outright felt wrong. In my heart, I could feel something lurking in the back of my mind, that unsettling chill that crawled down my spine, whispering that something wasn't right. It wasn't until the night of the storm that I first started questioning his fixation as more than just harmless silliness. The lightning struck so close that the glass in our windows rattled, and the power flickered, plunging us into darkness. I stumbled to find my flashlight, but as I neared the staircase, a strange sound drifted from Aaron's post, a low, hypnotic hum, flowing like water over stones. My heart raced as I shone the beam toward him, but he appeared blissfully ignorant of my presence, completely entranced. Just then, the hum morphed into words, taunting me, whispering my name with an unsettling familiarity that sent ice through my veins. I wanted to reach for him, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, but my feet felt glued to the floor, unwilling to break the spell. "Aaron?" I finally squeaked. He blinked, his gaze coming into focus, and the look of pure confusion on his face was like a shard of glass slicing through my chest. "What's wrong?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. After stumbling over my words, I told him about the humming, but he shrugged it off as a trick of the storm. The next day, I decided to do some digging, researching stare sitting online, and my stomach fell. It was a bizarre phenomenon some called positional meditation, with connections to cult-like practices, which began painting a sinister picture in my mind. I thought of confronting him but was paralyzed by fear. What if the quiet surrender to the shadows was a sign of something darker, a part of him I didn't know? Days turned into weeks, and the frequency of his stare sitting escalated. Sometimes I could hear him murmuring, having conversations in a language I didn't recognize, while I became a ghost in our own home, hovering in the kitchens and bedrooms filled with toxic dread. One evening, desperation got the best of me, and I staked out in the hallway to confront him. I leaned against the wall, heart pounding, when I finally summoned the courage and confronted him, demanding he quit the odd ritual. But when I reached out, suddenly my world disintegrated as the air crackled around us. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his eyes wide with something I had never seen before, fear mixed with exhilaration. "They are waiting for me. The sound calls." I felt ice twisting in my stomach. There it was, the singular rift between us, with me standing firmly on one side, desperately trying to pull him back from whatever abyss he tumbled into. Panic washed over me, and I insisted we needed help, but Aaron only tightened his grip on the banister, eyes glistening as though he were torn, an entire universe breaking apart behind them. That was when the strange noises began. Every night after he started spiraling, the walls creaked and groaned, shadows flickered just out of view, like they were sneering at our fragile existence. I debated whether I should call someone or wake him, but then I hesitated and drowned in silence. I spent sleepless nights on the couch, terrified to wander near the stairs lest I catch a glimpse of whatever ethereal thing had captivated him. Then one night, just when I thought I could accept our new distorted reality, I awoke to find Aaron standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the blackness, taking on an almost ghostly posture, unblinkingly fixated on the top step, where a pale, flickering light began to materialize. My voice croaked as I called out, demanding to know what he could see, but he merely responded, "They're here now, they've come for me." Time shattered, I felt my heart racing and an overwhelming urge to flee. The very shadows that had once draped our home now felt like living entities, swirling and beckoning. In a moment of extreme desperation and instinct, I lunged and grabbed him, pulling him away from the bottom step, terrified of the fate he was so eagerly embracing. The light winked out with a pop, and he turned to me, rage and confusion flaring in his eyes before something in them dimmed, and he finally seemed to break free from whatever enchantment had gripped him. "What did you do?" he murmured, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. I took a step back, horrified yet relieved, realizing I had yanked him back from some tongue-in-cheek path that offered nothing but despair. We spent that night talking. I tried explaining the sounds, the way he'd been acting, the horror clawing through my mind. He listened, nodding slowly, but it felt like trying to stitch a gaping wound closed with nothing but threads of silence. He promised to stop sitting on the stairs, but the truth was, he didn't. He just did it when I wasn't home, and what was even worse? It didn't seem to bother him, a secret pathway he had invisibly carved for himself. The creaking of the stairs became my worst nightmare, a haunting reminder that something darker was tangled in the very fabric of our lives, gnawing at the edges of our reality. A few weeks later, I received a message from a friend who had seen a post on a local forum. It was about stair sitting, but this time the tone shifted towards something darker. Someone related their own experience, detailing people who had disappeared after embracing the dark rituals surrounding stair sitting. My heart crumpled as I understood too well that each tale resonated painfully with our own. I couldn't bear to think that Aaron was edging toward that fate, and that's when I realized it was no longer a simple quirk, it was a siren call to his very essence. One night, I confronted him yet again, my voice trembling as I pleaded for him to talk to me, to let me help him break free from this malevolent pull. He grew distant, his eyes glazing over as he muttered about how the connection was irreplaceable, his lips curling into a smile that made my skin crawl. In the pit of my stomach, I felt doom approaching, the shadows were gathering once again, a thick black fog creeping closer, and I didn't know if I could save him before it was too late. Things escalated into madness. Every time I caught him sitting, whispers would crawl through the house like a sinister echo, and I grew more frantic. I searched for solutions, scoured the web for anything that might help. Most advice seemed like a vague, foggy guide that only intensified the fear of my helplessness, but I stumbled upon a last resort suggestion, a ritual to confront what he now called the calling. I knew it could just as easily backfire, but if it meant saving him, I had to try. The night of the ritual came, and our home pulsed with an ominous energy as I set everything up, the air thick as I placed candles around us, trembling as I prepared to expose the heart of the problem once and for all. I asked him to sit on the stairs, to summon whatever dark force had wrapped itself around him, and for a moment, it appeared as if he was being pulled back into that strange trance as I followed behind, holding tightly to the love I had for him like a shield. When he closed his eyes and the shadows swirled, I could hear the faint sound of whispering, drawing us both in, and my mind was racing as I fought against the tangible hold they had on him. I felt like I was losing him all over again, but I pushed through. I cried out, begging for him to focus on me. Don't you see? They want you, but you're more than this. The energy shifted, rippling through the air, and I prayed for clarity, for him to break free from whatever malevolent grip was pulling him. For an agonizing moment, it looked as if he might not return, that the shadows would swallow him whole, but in a rush of courage, I wrapped my arms around his waist. It was a surge of feral determination that pulled him back to me, and he jolted awake, gasping as the dark whispers faded into silence. We fell back onto the floor, panting heavily. "I won't let you go," I cried, holding him tightly, as though I could sew his very essence back together. I thought we would be safe now, that the dark merely needed to be confronted, but a sudden realization crashed over me like thunder. Aaron's grin had shifted from a mere twisted amusement to something far more sinister. He whispered into my ear, "They're still here." The air turned cold, and even as I felt hope bloom in my chest, the shadows flickered back to life, thickening around us, absorbing my disbelief as they reached for my husband, my love, threatening to unravel every shred of light I still harbored. Now as I sit here, heart racing and hands trembling, I can't help but wonder if in my desperate attempts to save him, in defending against that haunting ritual, I've only placed myself within reach of the darkness too. AITA for defending my husband's stair-sitting habits? I think I already know the answer, and I'm terrified of what it may mean for the both of us. I never thought a simple issue like punctuality could unravel my life in such a terrifying way, but here I am, staring blankly at my phone, the glint of the screen reflecting my dread as I anticipate their all-too-familiar late arrival. My in-laws, the Johnsons, have turned tardiness into an art form. You see, it's not just the usual 15 minutes late, but often an hour, 2 hours, or sometimes not at all. Yes, they've pulled that stunt too, leaving me waiting in the restaurant, awkwardly pretending to enjoy a glass of wine while I wonder if they've been kidnapped by aliens or simply decided they'd rather binge-watch Friends than honor my dinner invitation. It's been years of this, and I've reached my breaking point. After yet another instance of me pacing the restaurant like a caged animal, I snapped and texted them a harsh message before this latest dinner with my wife's family: if you can't make it on time, don't come at all. When they finally arrived, nearly an hour late, my father-in-law's face twisted in confusion, while my mother-in-law tutted softly, like a schoolteacher reprimanding a particularly dull student, but I didn't back down when they stormed out, leaving the restaurant empty and echoing our abandoned table. The rest of the evening was a tense silence at home, the air thick with my wife's disappointment, which turned to anger after she received a text from her mother, suggesting her husband was a monster who couldn't handle a few minor inconveniences. That night, I lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of my wife on her phone, her whispered arguments and the occasional near sob causing shadows to loom taller in our bedroom, until, at last, she turned toward me and refused to speak, her back a cold wall of resentment. Days went by after this explosive dinner, leaving me isolated and uncertain, with strings of tension that felt heavier than the very air I breathed, filling our home with an oppressive silence that buzzed around me. I started noticing things. Maybe my nerves were getting to me, but every time I walked past my in-laws' house, the curtains would twitch just a little too much, and I could swear I saw shadows that felt out of place, as if someone was always watching, waiting for a moment to pounce. My phone lit up late one night, a photo from my mother-in-law. The image showed my unseen daughter, barely 3 years old, standing at the window with that innocent, quizzical gaze, while the backyard glowed with an unsettling, almost unnatural light. I felt my insides twist when I noticed the reflection in the window behind her. It was my mother-in-law, but there was something wrong in her eyes, something wild, a glint that sent ice running through my veins, though I brushed it off as paranoia, convinced I was simply spiraling due to the stress of family tensions. But things only escalated. I began finding notes on my car, slipped under the windshield wipers that only read, "Time is slipping away," with no signature. Just a trembling anxiety creeping further into my soul. I told my wife about it, although I regretted the moment I saw the doubt construct a fortress around her disbelief, and she suggested I was overstressed, living in a fog of paranoia, but I knew better. Something was horribly wrong, and it seemed to mirror the late arrivals of my in-laws. One rainy evening as I returned from work, I noticed them standing in their driveway, drenched, appearing almost ghostly in the dim light, and when they finally approached, they had that same eerie look. They claimed to have just arrived back from a trip, yet this wasn't a regular visit. My skin prickled with dread as I processed that the clothes they wore didn't match weather conditions, nor did they carry any luggage. They insisted on spending time with my daughter, and despite my instincts screaming at me to protect her, my wife played along, and I could only hang back, unease coiling like a serpent in my gut as they led her into the dark house, a cavernous maw waiting to swallow innocent laughter. Things went completely dark when my daughter didn't return for hours, and I rushed around, pacing, calling her name before I banged down my in-laws' door, only to find them sitting there, hazy, eyes shimmering as they told me they were just having fun. Yet my little girl's absence felt like an eternity, and each second stretched into endless possibilities, a knot twisted unyieldingly at my core. Panic welled inside me, erupting into visceral desperation as I tore through their house, the fading scent of something metallic pulling me further into the nightmare unfolding within each stagnant room as I began seeing bizarre photographs plastered on the walls, pictures of children playing but with disturbing overtones of something nefarious, like their laughter was forcibly infused into each snapshot, faces twisted into grotesque smiles that made my skin crawl. I finally found my daughter, sitting eerily still in a dim-lit kitchen, her eyes glazed over, staring blankly into space, as if something had siphoned the brightness from her soul. When I reached for her, a voice, low and viscous, crawled through the air, laced with ethereal confidence that suggested they had been waiting for me all along. "You have to let her stay, she's ours now." With a primal scream, I ripped my daughter from the table, sprinting out of the house while a collective whisper cascaded behind me, sharpness in the air, promising I had only buried the truth of their generational curse deeper beneath a facade of civility. I bolted down the street, holding my child tightly as the relentless echoes of their laughter melded into a cacophony of threat behind me. Now, every time I hear the doorbell ring or see their silhouettes hovering in the corner of my eye, I am reminded that I can't escape the haunting truth. It's all interconnected, the waiting, the late arrivals, the suffocating silence betraying a sinister undercurrent that knows our fears and plays with them like a puppet master. Realizing now that my choice to demand punctuality had awakened something within them that shouldn't have been stirred, and perhaps I sealed our fate when I thought I was just standing my ground. I wasn't the kind of guy who went around crushing the dreams of 7-year-olds, but something about my girlfriend's brother, Timmy, always rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he puffed out his chest as if he were a king while wearing his oversized superhero pajamas, or the fact that he made me play against him in video games every single time I came over because he was convinced he could beat me if I just dared to try. I used to let him win. Sure, I'd play a little harder than normal, but I figured it built his confidence. Timmy was a sweet kid otherwise, always the first to offer me a cookie from his stash or show me his favorite toy, but there was something almost sinister beneath the surface of that small, innocent face. It was his relentless whining every time I beat him, the way he would stomp his foot and demand I go again, claiming I was cheating as if I were some kind of adult monster trying to ruin his childhood. I tried to laugh it off. I didn't want to diminish a kid's spirit, but when he kept taunting me about how I was never going to beat him at anything ever, I felt that familiar itch to prove a point. It was a calm Saturday evening when I finally snapped. My girlfriend was baking cookies in the other room, and the sweet, chocolatey smell wafted through the air, mixing with Timmy's cries of frustration as I scored yet another winning point. "You just let me win, didn't you?" he accused, glaring at me with those huge, innocent brown eyes that suddenly didn't seem so innocent, as if the shadows of the dimly lit room were casting a spell that twisted his features into something darker. I took a deep breath, my heart racing as something primal ignited in me, a sudden desire not just to win, but to utterly destroy his confidence right then and there. "No, Timmy, this time it's for real," I said, feeling a surge of energy course through my veins. I wouldn't just let him win, I would crush him, mercilessly. As we picked up the controllers with renewed intensity, I focused my eyes on the screen, which seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, the colors flashing brighter as I dove deeper into the game. I performed moves I didn't even know I had inside me, deftly dodging every attack and countering every strategy he tried to pull. With each round I won, I expected Timmy to laugh or challenge me more fiercely, but the glow of the TV reflected in his gaze as he stared in stunned silence at the pixels that represented his rapidly fading hope. I felt exhilarated, but as his face fell, I also felt a strange chill creeping up my spine. It was as if the house around us was growing colder, the walls whispering tales of the arrogance of pride and the dark side of competition. "I'm not letting you win again, Timmy. This is just how it is, and you need to understand that." The words tasted bitter on my tongue as I said them, and for a moment, guilt washed over me like a cold wave crashing onto the shore of a lonely beach, but I pushed it aside and focused on the screen. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, I turned the game into a dominating disaster for him. I perfected the final move, and just as I hit the game's concluding action, the room was engulfed in darkness. The TV flickered and died, plunging us into an eerie silence, the only sound being the added stream of my own heavy breathing, and I felt every ounce of joy drain from the atmosphere as Timmy sat there trembling, his small hands clenched into fists that shook like leaves caught in a violent storm. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice a whisper as though he was terrified of the answer. I started to reply, but that was when I noticed the lights in the house flickering strangely, almost rhythmically, as if trying to communicate in a language only the children of nightmares could understand. The shadows lengthened, extending across the walls like spectral fingers grasping for something they shouldn't have, and in that moment, I realized that the darkness had not merely consumed the television but had troubled the very foundation of our reality. Timmy's laughter turned into a wheeze as he backed away from me, terror dancing in his features, and I don't know what compelled me from that point on, but I instinctively moved toward him, wanting to make him feel safe, wanting him to understand that I was still in control. When my hand brushed against his shoulder, the air turned heavy, the atmosphere thick with something sinister, something that had been lingering in the corners of the room, waiting for just this moment to reveal itself. I thought I heard whispers, distant and haunting, echoing within my mind, and they sounded alarmingly like Timmy's voice as he gasped and said, "I just wanted to win." And I couldn't help but laugh, a short, nervous chuckle that caught deep in my throat, because it suddenly became clear that this was about more than just winning a game. This had become a matter of life and death. Then he ran. Timmy bolted for the door, screaming his lungs out, but the house felt like it closed in around me, the walls twisting and folding until I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Shadows crawled along the floor like spiders, wrapping their clammy fingers around my ankles as I stumbled forward, trying to follow him, but it was as if the house didn't want me to leave. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in a blinding flash, and there stood Timmy, wide-eyed, as if he had just caught a glimpse of something unspeakably horrifying. Blood drained from my face as dread settled in my stomach. Whatever demon had stirred inside that game was now writhing between us, an unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Are you mad?" he stammered as fear carved lines into his innocent face, and just when I thought I'd backed myself into a corner from which I could never escape, I heard it, an echo of laughter, warped and malevolent, that seemed to seep from the very walls, shaking them with sinister intent. That's when I knew I had irrevocably broken something inside Timmy, something precious and innocent, and whatever darkness had awakened in that moment was now straining to escape. In that split second, I realized that I wasn't just facing the consequences of my cruel decision, I had unleashed something terrifying, a cruel shadow cast by my own hubris. A cold shiver snaked its way down my spine, as I whispered to Timmy, "I didn't mean for this to happen," but the words felt hollow and the room echoed back with an unsettling refrain, timid yet filled with a knowing horror. We stared into the face of an inexplicable fear, one that bore no physical form yet demanded to be reckoned with, and as I stood there paralyzed, I could almost feel the world fracturing beneath my feet. Those few seconds stretched long and thin, moments filled with understanding that some lines should never be crossed. I knew I needed to do something, to make amends while I could still grasp reality, but just then, Timmy's laughter resumed, only this time it sounded like the crackling of dry leaves underfoot, a boy's giggle turned cruel, echoing from the shadows that had seeped into the corners of the room. I was caught in a web of my own making, shackled by consequences, trapped in a darkness that bore witness to my mistakes, and I was left wondering if I had indeed become the monster in the children's tale I'd once considered so innocent, the very arbiter of nightmares unleashed upon this world in an unthinking act of pride. I never thought that a simple no could spiral my life into a relentless nightmare, but then again, I think we often underestimate how quickly the human mind can twist itself into the shape of malice. It all started when my neighbor, who I had always considered friendly, knocked on my door one chilly autumn afternoon. He was desperate, explaining that he had family visiting and no parking space available, pleading for just one day's use of my extra spot, something I had meticulously preserved since my brother had passed. I felt guilty, even as I formed my words, recalling that it wasn't my responsibility to accommodate him. "I'm sorry, but I really need that spot," I said firmly. He blinked, disappointment flashing across his face, and for a split second, I worried I had crossed some invisible line. "Okay, suit yourself," he replied, his voice slipping into that unsettling calmness that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. That evening, I settled into my usual routine, but the air in my apartment felt thick and stifling, as if the walls themselves were eavesdropping. The next day, I noticed my neighbor's car parked in front of my driveway, blocking my entrance. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but now it felt like a direct challenge. I stepped outside, greeted by a swollen sense of dread. "Could you move your car?" I called out, forcing a smile that felt feeble. His response sent chills racing along my spine. "Not my fault your spot is empty, is it?" From then on, it felt like a war, each day adding fuel to the fires of resentment. He called in false complaints about my late-night music, Neighborhood Watch was informed that I had too many guests parked out front, and it wasn't long before I realized he made it clear to others that I was a nightmare neighbor. The whispers slithered through the streets like an unwelcome fog, suffocating every connection I'd formed in the block. Isolation wrapped around me, a warm but suffocating blanket. I went to my car one moonlit evening only to find it scratched, deep gashes carved across the pristine paint. I stood there, heart racing, and it hit me that this was no coincidence. When I confronted him, he merely laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that haunted me even in my dreams. It wasn't long before every friendly face in the neighborhood turned away, lost somewhere in the disarray of rumors and twisted truths. I decided to take a different route and began documenting everything, each incident meticulously noted in a notebook, the complaints, the damage, the ominous notes slipped under my door. It felt sensible at first, like a lifeline thrown into a pool of chaos, but as the pages turned, the act felt increasingly paranoid and desperate. One night, racked with anxiety, I curled up on my couch with a few glasses of wine, hoping the alcohol would dull the sharp edges of fear. While grappling with insomnia, I decided to check my doorbell camera, both for shreds of sanity and evidence. I just wanted to run through the footage of the night I had scratched paint. To my horror, I discovered something I could never have anticipated, my neighbor standing outside, wearing a thick black hoodie, his face obscured beneath the darkness of a winter night. He loomed by my car, pouring some clear liquid onto the trunk. It shimmered like a bright star when it caught the light. I panicked, realizing I had forgotten to lock my door. Shoving past the beers and the remnants of junk food, defense mechanisms against the chilling apprehension now boiling my blood, I ran to the door, my heart pounding a thunderous rhythm. I flung it open, but he was gone, leaving behind an echo of laughter that felt like ice spilling through my veins. The next day, I filed a police report, but the officer, a weary middle-aged man with coffee stains on his uniform, seemed more amused than concerned. "Just a neighbor dispute, ma'am, nothing serious," he chuckled, dismissing my escalating paranoia while I insisted through gritted teeth that his actions had crossed an unsafe line. Days turned into weeks, but the situation escalated. One morning, I woke to find my entire car was covered in eggs, some smashed and gunky, the others still intact like rotten grenades. I could no longer discern the difference between reality and a waking nightmare. Was it even possible for someone to be that vindictive? A dark reflection of my own thoughts bubbled up, suggesting maybe this monsoon of chaos wouldn't end until I retaliated, until I dove as deep into this nightmarish rabbit hole as he had. But just as I found a tiny ember of resolve within, unease cloaked me as I spied him staring at me one lonely afternoon, a wide grin plastered across his face. It twisted something inside me. Perhaps this was all a game to him. I sought answers, diving into deeper roots. I tracked whispers of past neighbors who had endured their own terror at his hands, piecing together a fractured narrative that revealed a history soaked in acrimony. Each encounter morphed into dread, the shadows thickening with lies. The sense of friendship had crystallized into something sinister. My final attempt to reclaim my space felt extravagant, even foolish. I tossed out everything I had documented and staged a confrontation I knew bordered on insanity. The night felt thick with foreboding as I cornered him outside, demanding he leave me alone, but he merely laughed again, that infuriating, deep sound that wrapped around my consciousness like a vice. "Why don't you focus on managing your own space instead of wasting time at my door?" His words rolled over me like a cold wave. In that moment, I recognized the absurdity of trying to fight someone so twisted, so bent. I stepped back, something inside me fracturing as I muttered, "You'll regret this," my voice small, an echo of fading confidence. And just as I turned to leave, I heard what felt like the closing act of a narrative gone awry, my heart halting when he called out to me one last time, "You already have." I drove that evening, not to work or friends, but to the edge of sanity, piecing together the tangled web of fear and loathing that had bared itself in my life. It took time, but in those shockingly still moments, clarity descended upon me. I understood my only option to end this sick game was to move away permanently, to cleanse myself of the taint of his shadowy presence. As I packed, every belonging stripped away from the condo felt like an entanglement burnt from me. I left that apartment a shell of who I was, yet had it ever truly been mine? I shrugged off the weight of his existence like a snake distilling its skin. But as I drove toward the next chapter in my life, with a bittersweet taste, I vowed to never forget the lesson learned. In neighborhoods where darkness breeds, kindness is a fickle facade, and sometimes refusing to let others in comes with a heavy price. Growing up, I always knew I was different from the other kids in my town. While most families seemed whole and uncomplicated, my reality was a patchwork quilt of half-truths and familial tensions, my parents' marriage a fragile thing that shattered when I was just 15. It was then that my mom revealed to me the existence of my half-sister, Lily, a product of my dad's affair, and though I initially felt a strange sort of sympathy for her, that empathy twisted and hardened as years went by. With my mother constantly torn between her loyalty to our bloodline and the shame her husband's infidelity brought upon us, she began to favor Lily, at least in the subtler, unmeasured ways, an extra scoop of ice cream at parties, bonus minutes spent in delighted conversation that I never seemed to earn. It came to a head when my mother decided to gift Lily our family's most prized heirloom, a delicate silver necklace adorned with a single emerald, which had belonged to my grandmother and was said to carry the blessings of strength and resilience. That summer evening, as I stood there aghast, Lily grinning in delighted astonishment while my heart pounded like a war drum echoing betrayal through my veins, I felt my chest constrict with such a mix of emotions, rage, contempt, and something jaggedly sharp that I'd only admit to myself years later, a deep, gnawing sense of loss. I told her she didn't deserve it, the words spilling out of my mouth like venom, and for a moment the air was thick with a silence that amplified the quiet sobs my mother stifled. In an instant, Lily's joy was crushed under the weight of my accusation, her face paling. "You don't even know me," she retorted, but the words cut deeper than any knife, and for a fleeting moment, I saw irritation fuse with sadness in her eyes. Everything spiraled after that. My mom refused to talk to me, her disappointment a tangible cloud that enveloped our home, wrapping itself so tightly around me that I suffocated in shame. I convinced myself I was right, that I was standing up for the sanctity of our family line, not to mention my grandmother's memory, but every day that dragged into weeks left a bitter residue on my soul, and Lily was the ghost haunting me wherever I went until one nameless, starlit night I found myself on my way to meet her, a stupid impulse driving me forward like a moth to a flame, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could mend the frayed edges of the relationship I sabotaged so recklessly. Lily lived in an old Victorian that smelled of mildew and neglect, her laughter once light-hearted now tinged with a hardness that spoke of years spent being a shadow, always outshined by a bone-deep allure of a necklace she knew would never belong to her. She opened the door with hesitation, and I noticed the way her eyes flickered with a cocktail of surprise and cautious hope. "What do you want?" she asked, but the sharpness of her tone melted the moment she caught sight of the little box I held closely, the very one my mother had used to gift her that damned necklace. "I'm sorry," I stuttered, feeling the weight of my words evaporate in the cool night air. "I wanted you to have it, because it's not the necklace that matters, it's what it represents, the love and connection that comes with it." Yet as I held out the small box, Lily's expression shifted, confusion wrinkles furrowing her brow. "You're just saying that because of Mom," she whispered, bitterness flowing through every syllable, making me realize how wrong I was to believe that a simple apology would eclipse the years of resentment we shared. But then, she surprised me, her eyes softening as she slowly reached for the box, delicate fingers trembling, and I felt a warm swell in my chest. For a moment, we exchanged something sacred, a flicker of that sisterly bond that had been buried in the rubble of our complicated heritage. But in the back of my mind, a plaguing thought lingered: what if the real ghost that was haunting me wasn't the fractured family ties but rather what lay inside that necklace box? As the night unfolded, and shadows danced across her living room, something broke in me when I finally said, "It's cursed." Lily laughed, a sound that echoed against the walls, disbelief sparkling in her eyes, but I persisted, recounting the whispers I'd heard, the warnings passed down through years, that the necklace held a dark secret. My grandmother had insisted on wearing it every single day until her last breath, her slow decline a shadowed testimony to its malevolence. That revelation hung in the air like a lightning storm, and I hoped the curse would shatter the moment, expose any fragile connection we had. But when Lily pulled the necklace from its velvet resting place, I swear I felt the temperature drop as darkness unfurled around us, an unsettling whisper brushing through the air, weaving itself through the tension. "You think I can't handle it?" she challenged, heart blazing with defiance, and my stomach dropped as I caught her twisting the delicate chain around her neck, the emerald glimmering ominously at the hollow of her throat. The lights flickered, shadows growing long and distorted, stretching across the room, and I felt as if I was standing at the edge of a precipice as dread unfurled like a storm. I approached her cautiously, my heart racing, assuring her it was just an old wives' tale, but the moment she pressed her fingertips against the cool emerald, my voice was drowned out by a rumble, the ground beneath us trembling. Suddenly, with a crash, the windows shattered violently, a gust of icy wind rushing in, a fury unleashed. I screamed for her to take it off, but she stood there, frozen, eyes wide with a mix of terror and exhilaration, a new kind of laughter spilling from her lips that sent chills down my spine. In that instant, I knew we were no longer searching for forgiveness, nor sisterhood, but rather that darkness was claiming her, just as it had claimed our grandmother. The necklace now tangled around her like a malevolent snake, it began to glow with an ethereal light, and as the horrifying truth dawned on me, I realized I didn't just destroy our family's legacy, I unleashed a haunting that neither of us could escape. It was too late for apologies now. With a heartbreaking resolve, I rushed towards her, desperate to rip it away, but unearthly sounds erupted from the shadows, screeching and wailing, a cacophony promising suffering, promising that we had both become part of something far beyond our understanding. The necklace glowed brighter, swallowing her whole as Lily screamed, an echo of anger, fear, and, above all, despair, before she simply vanished, the necklace spiraling into darkness as my heart shattered. I stumbled back, gasping, the world around me disassembling into chaos as I realized, the truth was never about deserving the necklace, it was about the curse that tethered us both to the ghosts of our past, and in my heart, I knew I would forever carry the weight of what happened that night, a sister still lost to the shadows, the necklace a constant reminder that in this twisted story, no one was truly innocent and I was left haunted by the question, Ida, for telling my half-sister she didn't deserve my mom's necklace? I never thought that allowing my mother to host Thanksgiving dinner at my house would lead to such chaos, but here we are, 3 days away from the holiday, and all I can think about is how I may have opened the door to something unspeakable. My wife, Sarah, is heavily pregnant with our 4th child and has been feeling exhausted and anxious, so I thought it would be a kind gesture to let my mother take over the cooking this year. She's been insisting on bringing her classic turkey and stuffing for as long as I can remember, and although my mother is eccentric, let's just say her ideas about food are unique, she promised she wouldn't do anything too outlandish this time. Since our first Thanksgiving together as a married couple, I've always felt the pressure of blending our families in the presence of holiday cheer, and Sarah has been under so much stress already. But as the day approaches, I've started to notice things that make my skin crawl. It began when my mother presented a package of what she claimed were secret spices for the turkey, each ingredient labeled with cryptic names. She explained they were traditional family recipes passed down for generations, but there was something eerie about the way her eyes sparkled when she mentioned them, like a wolf revealing its meal after a successful hunt. Sarah, noticing my discomfort, told me to ease up and let my mom have her fun, but late at night, when it was just the 3 of us and the kids were asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I could hear my mother moving around the kitchen, testing her concoctions and humming strange lullabies that felt foreign, even menacing, in their melody. The scent of the spices wafting into the living room was strangely intoxicating, laced with an undertone that made me feel both dizzy and anxious, and every time I tried to confront her, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand, claiming it was all in good spirit and for the family. It was around this same time that I found our youngest, Emma, talking to what she described as an invisible friend who made her giggle loudly at odd moments. Kids her age often have imaginary friends, but when I pried deeper, Emma's stories took on a bizarre, unsettling tone. "He says Grandma's food is magic and that we're all invited to dinner," she'd say, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation, as if she were caught between a dream and a nightmare. As Thanksgiving Day neared, my anxiety spiraled, and it didn't help that Sarah was increasingly sleepy and withdrawn, unable to shake what she described as a lingering fog in her mind. It was then that I went to look for my mother, only to find her hunched over the kitchen table, her fingers dripping with purple-red juices that I didn't want to think too hard about. "I'm just preparing the turkey, sweetie, don't worry," she said with an unsettling grin that stretched across her face, revealing crooked teeth that seemed to glisten with something unholy. I saw a glimpse of the turkey, its skin was unnaturally glossy, and there were an array of small, round wounds where the feathers had once lain, looking almost like a string of pearls encased in the fleshy, glistening skin. "Where did you get this?" I uttered, trying to keep my throat from constricting too tightly. My mother looked back at me, her expression shifting from affectionate to something feral, and though she didn't answer, the air in the room thickened with a kind of infectious dread. I stumbled backward, grappling with the chill creeping up my spine, convinced my mother was losing her mind. Before I could leave, she whispered, "They'll love it, they were waiting for you," and my heart raced painfully at the insinuation. It was without question a breaking point. I confronted Sarah, suggesting we uninvite my mother, but her response left me stunned. "Let her do this, please. I think I need it. I don't want to deal with anything else right now." I pestered her for weeks, but with that hint of desperation in her voice, I felt backed into a corner. Thanksgiving came, and the atmosphere was rife with tension. I attempted to remain composed as friends and family arrived, but a discomforting strain hung over us, a dark cloud shrouding the festivities. The food, glistening in all its macabre beauty, began to arrive, turkey adorned with crimson glimmers, sides overflowing with vibrant colors, the very air filled with an intoxicating sweetness that made my head spin. As we sat at the table, I eyed the kids, who eagerly hovered over the food, whispering secrets amongst one another, fueled by some silent pact I couldn't grasp. I watched in horror as they took their first bites, followed by delightful gasps and soft giggles, every forkful seeming to ignite their spirits to heights I'd never seen before, yet there was an edge of something primal in their delight. The adults, too, were transfixed, chatting joyfully as if no one else could sense the creeping chill between us, the hallucinations in the corners of visions that twisted laughter into darker sounds. My chest tightened as I felt my mother's gnarled fingers brush against my shoulder, and she leaned in to whisper, "They told me this day would come, that all would be well. Don't you see, this is how we keep the magic alive?" I felt ice coil around my heart, the ominous weight of her words settling deep within me. The moment Emma leaned across the table, her smile too wide, too predatory, to announce that Grandma's magic tastes so good. And my body began to betray me, the urge to scream battling against my instinct to protect. And then, just as quickly, I felt my resolve waver, almost collapsing under the deliciously dark enchantment that twisted through the air like invisible threads binding us all. That evening blurred between reality and terror, all of us trapped in a dreamscape where joy danced alongside malevolence. I realized with a jolt that the children were not simply enjoying a Thanksgiving feast, something dangerous was unfolding. Before I could act, the lights flickered, plunging us into shadows, and as confusion reigned, Sarah's voice echoed through the darkness, "We're all just pieces in her game," tinged with an eerie, knowing calmness, as if she were in on a secret knowing I could not comprehend. At that moment, I felt an exhilarating thrill of the macabre awakening deep inside, tearing at the ties of sanity as I become a spectator in this grotesque festival, watching my family become enraptured, my mother's soft laughter raking through the cracks of normality, as they surrendered to a feast that was anything but ordinary. I could hear a soft chant rise from the children, their words swirling like whispers carried on the wind, and that night, as darkness settled, I understood that I had failed my family. What I had thought to be a simple holiday dinner had turned into a horrifying rite, where every bite tightened the grip of something lurking, hungry, at the edges of my world, drawn in by a maternal force that would stop at nothing to ensure that this Thanksgiving would never end. I've always been protective of my belongings, especially my expensive headphones. They were a gift from my grandfather before he passed, and they're not just headphones, they're a piece of my history, my sanctuary. Living in a small, cramped apartment with my roommate, Jenna, had its challenges, especially when it came to boundaries. Jenna was charming in her own right, a free spirit, a whirlwind of messy hair and bright laughter that could fill a room, but she also had a way of pushing my limits, always borrowing things without asking and then somehow convincing me it was totally okay. A few months ago, she borrowed my headphones for the first time, saying her own had broken, and though I had reservations, I couldn't say no when she gave me that pleading look. But when I noticed the small scratches on the ear pads upon their return, my stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and sadness. It felt like she was borrowing not just my headphones but part of my soul, and every damage was a betrayal. Weeks passed, and I resolved to keep the headphones locked up whenever I left the apartment, but last Friday, she approached me with her typical sunny smile, asking to borrow them just for a quick session. I hesitated, feeling that familiar unease wash over me. "Please, just for a couple of hours. I promise I'll be super careful." But recalling the state they had returned in last time, I couldn't help but instinctively shake my head. The conversation escalated. She accused me of being selfish and paranoid, and while she ranted, I felt my heart race, my mind racing as I tried to explain the value of that gift, but my words fell upon deaf ears. It spiraled into a shouting match, and I was ready to slam the door against her face just to feel vindicated for standing my ground. But when night fell and I thought I would have the space to breathe, something felt off. As I lay in bed, the silence of the apartment grew oppressive, and a creeping sense of dread settled over me. The moment I heard the unmistakable click of the door opening, my heart stopped. I glanced at my phone, 2:13 a.m. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but the soft sound of something sliding against the hardwood floor got louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of my headphones being moved. I shot out of bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Peeking around the corner into the dimly lit living room, I saw Jenna hunched over my desk, glancing back nervously, her fingers intertwined with the cords of my headphones, the terrible glint of defiance in her eyes. "I know you're up. It's just a pair of headphones," she hissed, her tone laced with an eerie calmness that sent chills down my spine. I could have chosen to scream, to lash out or call her out, but something deep within me made me instinctively choose a cold silence, watching eerily as she continued to act like a thief in the night. An unsettling rush washed over me. I knew then that this wasn't about the headphones, this was a battle of wills, and I had no intention of losing. "You think I'm just going to let you take them?" I finally managed to whisper, breaking our shared silence, my voice low enough to shake among the shadows. The moment stretched into an eternity as her eyes widened in surprise, but then, to my horror, a sinister smile crept across her face, as though she relished being challenged. "You need to lighten up, you really do," she said, her voice becoming mocking, each word dripping with disdain. "The world won't end if you just let go a little." I felt a fire spark in my chest, booting my fight or flight instincts into high gear, as I stepped out into the living room, the shadows closing in around me like a predator ready to pounce. "You're not taking them from me, Jenna," I said, now resolute. Her confusion morphed into anger, and in return, I felt an unnatural strength overcome me. It was almost like I was possessed by a vengeful spirit teaching me the gravity of self-defense. Just as she reached for the headphones, I lunged, gripping her wrist tightly as I felt the aura shift between us, transforming the air into ice. After a tense grapple, she finally shoved me away, stumbling back, and in that moment, something terrifying happened. The lights flickered, casting a creepy shadow against the walls, dancing as if mirroring our turmoil. "You don't understand what you're asking for," she whispered, her voice suddenly trembling. "You don't know what happens when you refuse someone something they want." The atmosphere became thick with unsung words. My pulse quickened, every rational thought screaming for me to vacate the situation, but I was locked in, eyes wide as Jenna approached me, menacingly, almost hypnotically. "You think this was just about the headphones? You're clueless, and now," she leaned closer until I could smell her panic and desperation, "now you're in the way." Before I could react, the faint blare of my headphones crackled to life, pulling me out of her chaotic hold. Colors swirled as if the universe had reset. I closed my eyes, feeling the world spin, a haunting whisper flooding my senses, "You should have let me borrow them." As the sound overtook me, I realized too late that I had not only lost my headphones but perhaps something far more precious, my peace of mind. I bolted from the apartment, not daring to look back, propelling me through the night air and into the unknown, knowing I could never step foot back in there again. Because sometimes, the people we trust the most harbor darkness just waiting for the slightest chance to uncover itself, and sometimes, in refusing something that feels insignificant, you find that you've awakened something truly terrifying lurking just beneath the surface. I never thought a simple conversation would spiral into a nightmare that would haunt me for years, but here we are. It all started on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other. I was sitting in my homeroom, surrounded by the hum of morning chatter, when Jacob, the class clown with a well-deserved reputation for chaos, turned to me with a smirk that made my stomach drop. Just moments before, I'd finally managed to brush off the whispers about my appearance. My thick glasses and untamed hair were like red flags to my peers, an invitation for their cruelty. But when Jacob said it, I felt the world around me fall away. He called me a slur I thought I'd never hear directed at me, a word loaded with hate and ignorance, so vile it caught in my throat like the last bite of a bad meal. I was frozen, my heart racing, knowing that confronting him would only lead to more taunts, but doing nothing felt like accepting defeat. After class, I couldn't shake off that moment, that bite of venom that whispered to me that I was less deserving of respect simply for being different. Against my better judgment, I decided to go to my guidance counselor, Mrs. Perkins, a woman known for her warm smile and the jam-packed schedule of students desperate to be heard. She was trusted by many, or so I thought. I walked in, rehearsing my words, ensuring that I could convey the hurt without sounding too weak. But as I recounted the story, I noticed her expression shift. It seemed like understanding morphed into disappointment. "You need to speak to him directly," she said, her voice steady yet devoid of compassion, and for a moment, I thought I was being brave, but a sense of dread settled in my chest. The next day, Jacob approached me with his usual swagger, but something was different. There was an intensity in his eyes, an expectation that coiled around us like a noose. I could feel the eyes of my classmates on us, holding their breath like they were waiting for a fight or, worse, a spectacle. Jacob leaned in closer, a sneer on his lips, and whispered, "You told on me, didn't you?" His voice dripped with malice, and in that moment, I realized I had walked into a trap of my own making. As I tried to find my voice, to say that I only wanted to be treated with a shred of dignity, he laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that echoed through the empty hallways, and my stomach twisted in a painful knot. The humiliation built with every laugh that chimed in around me. It was a familiar family of taunts, all mercilessly joining in, and I felt my standing as the target solidifying so solidly that it shook my core. I wanted to deny everything, to crawl into myself and disappear, but Jacob leaned in even closer, taunting me to deny it. I stumbled over my words, unable to fight back, and he responded by tossing out another slur, like throwing a stone into a glass house. His words shattered any belief I had in justice, and the following weeks turned into a blur of relentless bullying, an onslaught that transformed my once quiet school life into a daily battle of survival. The more I tried to advocate for myself, the worse it got. Whispers crept into the cafeteria, photoshopped images emerged on social media, and suddenly I was the joke of our school year. Each day, I pulled my hoodie tighter around me, a flimsy shield against the arrows of cruelty that seemed to fly directly in my direction. I lost friends, I lost joy, and I sat in silence while my name became synonymous with ridicule. I began dreading the walk through those school doors, feeling the heavy weight of shame, like a cloak that had been stitched together by every cruel word. It was as if every laugh in the hallway was a reminder that some stories have no heroes, only victims. I started seeing Mrs. Perkins less as an ally and more as a source of disappointment. Her suggestion echoed in my mind: had I been weak by telling her? By doing something? I felt caught in a web of self-loathing and guilt, one that twisted itself tighter every time I was labeled as a tattle or, worse, a coward. My trust in adults wore thin, slipping through my fingers like sand as I realized this cacophony of cruelty felt tolerated. Days bled into weeks, each worse than the last, until one fateful afternoon when Jacob decided to take things further. During gym class, in a cruel stroke of fate, he managed to coordinate a moment that would forever mark my life. I was paired with him for a team exercise. The moment he stepped closer, I could smell the sweat mixed with arrogance, a vile combination that churned in my gut. "Are you going to run away like a little brat?" he sneered, pouring scorn into those words, and every ounce of my resolve melted away. Instead of freezing, instead of standing tall, anger surged through me, fueled by weeks of torment and shame. In a fit of rage, I swung my arm, a clumsy, desperate act born from pain, but it landed hard against his shoulder. The room silenced as if time itself had held its breath. I couldn't take my eyes off his shocked face, and for a fleeting moment, I felt powerful. But any sense of triumph was short-lived. Before I knew it, he retaliated with venomous fists, turning that forgotten gymnasium into a cage of chaos. I'd become the villain in my own story, surrounded by chaos, and the teachers pulled us apart, leaving us sitting in opposite corners of the principal's office as the narrative twisted. I was labeled the aggressor, the troublemaker, while Jacob donned his martyr's mask of innocence. Moments later, under the fluorescent lights that seemed to mock me, I finally spoke up, fearing for my future yet again. I recounted everything: how I had tried to stand up, how I had only wanted help, but in the eyes of the adults, I was merely misbehaving. "This isn't my fault," I cried, the desperation in my voice ringing hollow under their indifferent gazes. I became the conversation topic in whispers during lunch, and a target in the anxiety-ridden dreams that plagued me every night. My friends distanced themselves, afraid of catching what they labeled my drama. I lived in isolation, cocooned in a construct of my own guilt, paralyzed by the need for validation while crumbling beneath the weight of blame. The dreams turned darker, the whispers morphed into chants echoing in my head. I began to wonder if maybe I did belong in the shadows, if Jacob had been right all along. A year went by, each day a collection of silent scars grafted into my soul, and just when I began considering leaving school altogether, a weird email appeared in my inbox, one that made my breath hitch and my heart race. It contained a recorded conversation between Jacob and a mutual friend, a confession made in chuckles and arrogance, affirming that he orchestrated the entire thing with malicious intent, to bring me down, to revel in my despair. In a world that had painted me into a corner, I emerged, holding this tiny, clipped audio, a talisman of truth. Part of me wanted to send it off, share it with everyone who had ever judged me, but fear laced my hands. Who would believe me? I could feel the familiar voice in my head saying it was all just my fault for ever speaking to the counselor, that I had become nothing more than someone to be ridiculed. But I couldn't let Jacob's cruel laughter win. The next morning, I stood there, heart pounding, as I played the recording from Mrs. Perkins, tears of rage spilling over. She listened, the colors draining from her face, each slur echoing like a drum roll at a dark circus act. Days later, the principal called an emergency assembly, and for the first time in so long, the power had shifted. I stood in front of the student body, fog settling behind my eyes as I recounted the truth, knowing there may be repercussions but refusing to be the puppet in this horrid tale any longer. The gasps around the gymnasium filled the space like a chasm of realization, and the terrible weight of how I had felt for so long began to lift like a dawn breaking through a long night. Jacob faced the consequences. Suddenly, my once silent monster wore chains, and slowly the whispers turned into empathy. But still, as I left the auditorium that day, I could feel the air around me stifled with the remnants of hatred and, for the first time, a flicker of hope ignited. It wasn't an end, it was just the beginning of understanding that sometimes, telling the truth, no matter how painful, can set you free. Yet, no matter how much I felt liberated from the chains he had forged, I knew that I would carry the scars of that battle forever. So, I ask you, AITA, for telling the guidance counselor my classmate called me a slur? Because somewhere deep down, I am still that kid whose heart raced at the thought of being silenced, and to this day, that fear lingers, waiting for its moment to return. I'm writing this because I'm terrified, and I need to share my story before it consumes me. It all started innocently enough. My mother-in-law, Diane, was a well-meaning woman, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself in the years we spent feigning cordiality while navigating her unpredictable rages. A few weeks before her death, when she was confined to a hospital bed after a sudden heart attack, she let slip her plans for her will. We sat there, my husband and I, sipping weak coffee in that sterile waiting room, our expressions shifting from bored to tense as she rambled on about the 5 timeshares she insisted were a gift from the heart. 5 timeshares, 1 in the Bahamas, 2 in the Smoky Mountains, and 2 in Oregon, all racking up an eye-watering total of $9,500 in annual fees. We had explicitly told her we couldn't maintain such burdens, especially since we were trying to stabilize our own lives after the pandemic, but she had become a different person. In her fevered state, she grew angry, her voice rising until the monitors beeped in protest, spitting out an array of frantic notes, and as they moved to stabilize her, I felt something shift in the air. We lost her a day later, and with her went those ominous plans like a dark storm cloud hovering over us. When we gathered with the family days later to read the will, her attorney handed over a neatly typed paper outlining her loving gifts. I felt the blood drain from my face as I scanned the page, but as I looked around the room, none of my in-laws seemed to flinch. Their expressions were almost gleeful, like they were satisfied with her eccentric logic. I turned to my husband, gauging his reaction, but he was silent, a muscle twitching at his jaw. That's when I felt my gut twist. Did they know something I didn't? I brushed it off, thinking that maybe this was her outrageous way of keeping us tied to her legacy. Yet, as the days passed, keeping up with anonymous letter after letter from the timeshare companies demanding payment, I began to feel something lurking in the shadows. The first sign I noticed was at our doorstep, a heavy package wrapped in a dark, coated paper with no return address. I opened it to find an ominous leather binder embossed with an insignia I didn't recognize, a serpent intertwining with a skull, each letter ominously fading into the worn edges. Inside, an old photograph showed timeshares with figures that looked hauntingly familiar. My heart raced as I flipped through, affirmation of Diane's haunting grip still latching onto us, grinning maliciously through the ages. I felt the chill of unseen eyes, and it escalated to a weekly affliction. Every Monday, more packages arrived, and with them, an ever-deepening dread. They held strange notes, requests that revealed an unsettling trend. Each note dished out threats about some familial pact that had gone unfulfilled, with instructions no one could decipher. It claimed that we would own not only the timeshares, but also their dark histories, leading us to confront shattered memories of the past I didn't know I was connected to. My husband became a shell of who he was, slowly deteriorating under the pressure of family whispers, and it broke my heart to watch as he no longer found solace in our home. We fought more, and nights devolved into silence as we each lay awake, haunted. Then, one night while unpacking a new round of letters, I stumbled upon something even darker, a crudely drawn map with arrows leading to the bases of the timeshare properties, each one marked with an X. As I studied it, the atmosphere in the room thickened, and I could hear my husband yelling at something invisible. He was in a fit, begging for whatever dark presence to leave us alone as he drew back into that despondent spiral. I watched in horror as the glow around him dimmed. Suddenly, he wasn't himself anymore. The land where we thought we would craft memories had begun to consume us, revealing secrets that had long lingered in the shadows. We tried cutting ties, but the letters became more menacing, each threatening paragraph ushering in a new realm of despair. Then came the nightmares. They were vivid, bringing echoes of Diane standing at the edge of a storm-lashed beach, her laughter twisted and echoing as though she enjoyed watching us writhe in agony, and each night, it felt like we were being pulled into an abyss where neither of us could escape. My husband grew distant, wrapped in unfathomable darkness until one evening I woke up to find him gone. Panic set in as I searched everywhere, only to find the door ajar, leading to the open night air where the moon hung heavy. It was at that moment I realized he had become entrapped in the very thing Diane had left us, a cursed possession disguised as a gift. I ran toward the beach as fear surged through me, and at the water's edge, I caught sight of him standing there, entranced by something in the distance. I screamed, but the waves drowned me out, and by the time I reached him, his eyes were glazed over, filled with a stirring malice that raised my hair and froze my breath. It wasn't him anymore, it was something sinister wearing his skin as the ground trembled beneath me. I stumbled back, realizing that Diane's gift was more than financial, it was an unholy legacy. Now, every time a package arrives, every whisper from our family or sighting at our doorstep sends chills washing over me. I can't tell what's real anymore, and as the letters demand my husband's soul, I feel the tide rise, cleaving our fates, one letter at a time. So here I am, terrified and alone, begging for someone to believe me, drowning in the legacy she intended for us, an inheritance of which we never asked. But now it feels like we've entered an irrevocable deal with the dead, and each passing day, I fear I will wake up at the water's edge and find him gone forever, consumed by the darkness, forever tangled in the serpent's embrace.